I want to speak to you about something that has been quietly unfolding in the lives of many people, something so subtle that it often goes unnoticed, and yet so profound that it changes the entire orientation of one's life. There is a strange moment that arrives for some, not announced by crisis or catastrophe, but by a simple preference, a preference to stay home, to close the door, to sit quietly, to cancel plans without guilt, without explanation, without drama. And when this moment arrives, most people immediately distrust it. They assume something has gone wrong. They wonder if they are becoming lazy, antisocial, disconnected, or depressed. But I would like to suggest something quite different. I would like to suggest that very often this is not a withdrawal from life at all. It is an awakening within it. You see, we live in a culture that has confused movement with meaning. We assume that if we are busy, we are alive. If we are surrounded, we are connected. If we are visible, we are valuable. And so from an early age, we are trained to keep moving, keep engaging, keep presenting ourselves outwardly. We learn to associate stillness with stagnation, solitude with loneliness, silence with absence. But this association is learned. It is not inherent. And like all learned patterns, it can be questioned. There comes a time in the life of a spiritually awakening person when the noise of the world begins to feel strangely coarse. Not because the world is wrong, but because one's sensitivity has changed. What once felt stimulating now feels draining. What once felt exciting now feels repetitive. What once felt like connection now feels like performance. And this is the key point that is so rarely understood. The withdrawal into solitude is not a rejection of people. It is a rejection of pretense. Most social interaction, if we are honest, requires a subtle form of acting. We adjust our tone, filter our thoughts, soften our questions, exaggerate our enthusiasm, suppress our doubts. We do this not because we are deceitful, but because we are trained to belong. Belonging has always been linked to survival, and so the impulse runs deep. But there is a cost to this constant adjustment. Every time you edit yourself to be acceptable, you abandon a small piece of your inner truth. And over time, those pieces accumulate. You may not notice it at first, but eventually you feel tired in a way that sleep cannot cure. This is the exhaustion that spiritually awake people recognize. Not physical fatigue, but existential fatigue. The tiredness of living from the outside in. The weariness of constantly responding to expectations rather than listening to one's own being. And when this fatigue becomes clear enough, the soul does something very intelligent. It pulls inward. Staying home, then, is not avoidance. It is conservation. It is the psyche protecting itself from fragmentation. When you are constantly engaged with others, your attention is divided, your energy is dispersed, your sense of self becomes porous. But when you are alone, something remarkable happens. Your energy gathers, your thoughts slow, your inner rhythm reasserts itself. You begin to feel whole again. There is a widespread fear of being alone because most people have never actually met themselves. They have been too busy reacting, comparing, performing, and striving. Silence terrifies them because silence removes distraction. It removes the background noise that keeps uncomfortable questions at bay. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I actually want? What do I believe when I am not borrowing opinions? These questions arise naturally in solitude. And for those unprepared, they can feel overwhelming. But the spiritually awake are drawn precisely to this encounter. They sense that whatever they are seeking cannot be found in louder rooms. They begin to understand that clarity does not come from accumulation, but from subtraction. Not from adding more experiences, but from removing what is unnecessary. And so they stay home. They simplify. They reduce stimulation. They allow silence to do its quiet work. At first this can feel uncomfortable. The mind protests. It generates restlessness. It urges you to check something, to message someone, to go somewhere. This is not because solitude is harmful, but because the mind has been conditioned to constant input. We have become addicted to stimulation, to validation, to noise. Solitude then feels like withdrawal, but if you stay with it, if you resist the impulse to escape, something shifts. Gradually, the internal chatter begins to settle. The mind loses its urgency, and in that settling you begin to notice something that was always there but drowned out. A quiet presence, a sense of being that does not need to prove itself, a feeling of enoughness that is not dependent on approval. This is what many traditions have pointed to when they speak of the self, not the personality, not the ego, but the deeper awareness beneath them. This is why spiritually awake people often find crowded environments overwhelming. It is not arrogance, it is sensitivity. When you are deeply in touch with your own inner state, you feel disruptions more acutely. Superficial conversation feels abrasive. Forced enthusiasm feels jarring. Noise feels invasive. And so solitude becomes a form of hygiene, a way of keeping one's inner space clear. It is important to understand that this does not make a person antisocial, quite the opposite. It often makes them more capable of genuine relationship. When you are no longer desperate for connection, you can choose it freely. When you are no longer lonely in yourself, you can meet others without neediness. The spiritually awake person does not avoid people because they dislike them. They avoid situations that require them to be less than real. There is also a profound shift in how time is experienced in solitude. When you are constantly engaged socially, time feels fragmented. It is divided into appointments, obligations, events. But when you are alone, time expands, moments lengthen, awareness deepens. You are no longer rushing toward the next interaction. You are inhabiting the present. And this inhabiting is not passive, it is intensely alive. Many people mistake solitude for stagnation because they associate growth with visible activity. But some of the most important growth happens invisibly. A tree does not appear to be doing much in winter, yet something essential is taking place beneath the surface. Roots deepen, structure strengthens, preparation occurs. In the same way, the spiritually awake person uses solitude not to withdraw from life, but to integrate it. There is another dimension to this that is rarely discussed. When you stay home, when you step out of constant social reinforcement, you begin to see how much of your identity was being maintained by others. You notice which opinions were truly yours and which were borrowed. You notice which desires arose organically and which were implanted through comparison. This can be unsettling, it can feel like losing yourself, but in truth it is the opposite. It is the beginning of remembering who you are. This remembering requires space, it requires silence, it requires the courage to be with yourself without distraction. And this is why so few people do it. It is far easier to remain busy than to be honest. Far easier to scroll, socialize, and perform than to sit quietly with unanswered questions. But the spiritually awake understand that the discomfort of solitude is temporary, while the cost of self-abandonment is permanent. The world often misunderstands this inward turn. Friends may interpret it as rejection, family may worry, society may label it withdrawal. But these judgments arise from a shallow understanding of connection. True connection does not come from constant proximity, it comes from presence. And presence cannot be cultivated in a state of perpetual distraction. There is a deep paradox here. The more comfortable you become in your own company, the less isolated you feel. The loneliest people are often those who are never alone because they have never formed a relationship with themselves, but the one who can sit quietly, who can enjoy their own thoughts without fleeing from them, who can face their own emotions without immediately medicating or masking them, that person carries a quiet fullness. They are at home wherever they are. This is why spiritually awake people often lose interest in explaining themselves. They no longer feel the need to justify their choices. They understand that those who have not yet felt the call inward will not understand it, and that is fine. Silence becomes a form of confidence, not arrogance, but groundedness. Staying home then is not the end of engagement with the world, it is a recalibration of it. After time in solitude, the spiritually awake person often returns to social life differently, more selectively, more intentionally. They are drawn to conversations that matter, to people who can tolerate silence, to relationships that allow authenticity. And because such connections are rare, they no longer waste energy chasing substitutes. There is also something deeply spiritual that happens when you allow yourself to be alone consistently. You begin to see that you are not identical with your thoughts. Thoughts arise and pass, but something remains. You begin to notice that emotions move like weather, but you are the sky in which they appear. This recognition is subtle, but it is transformative. It loosens the grip of identity. It creates space between awareness and experience. In that space, freedom arises. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom from being constantly driven by impulse, fear, and expectation. You become less reactive, less compelled, more responsive. Life begins to feel less like something happening to you and more like something happening through you. And this is perhaps the deepest reason spiritually awake people stay home. They are learning to listen not just to themselves, but to life itself. In silence, patterns become visible. Intuition sharpens. Insight arises unforced. The answers that could never be found through effort appear naturally when the mind stops grasping. So if you find yourself preferring solitude, do not rush to correct it. Do not immediately label it as something to fix. Ask instead what it is teaching you. Ask what part of you is asking for space. Ask whether this inward turn is not avoidance but maturation. The seed does not apologize for going underground. The caterpillar does not explain itself while dissolving in the cocoon. There are phases of life that require invisibility. Growth is not always loud. Awakening is often quiet. Staying home is not giving up on the world. It is learning how to meet it without losing yourself. And when you finally step back out, you do so not as a fragment, not as a performance, but as a presence. And that presence, quiet though it may be, carries more depth than any noise-filled room ever could.